Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin here with my friend Dennis. Hey
What
Dennis,
up?
what up?
Hey,
What
man.
up? You
Sorry.
might wonder
Hey, Kevin.
where all our cool music is and why we're so relaxed. Because it's Labor Day weekend, days off, late night talk, late night chat with my handsome Eastern friend Dennis. Right, you like that? But for real, Labor Day night. Tomorrow we got the day off. We're having a little fun here talking about stuff like that. Kind of reminded of a quote that Abraham Lincoln famously once said regarding labor. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never existed if labor had not in the first place. Capital comes post labor, and in the grand scheme of things, when you see most of the time people come home from their job, from their work, from their engaging in getting capital, they just retire, drink their beer, fall asleep, do it as they do from being crushed by a machine. But this episode goes out to the time before capital, when labor was to subsist and to live. And afterwards, men looked up at the stars late at night, they charted them, and they talked about big, grand ideas. Because this episode is about grand ideas. And just like the night sky, before pollution, before light pollution, before ceilings that blocked us all, we're talking beauty. Da, na, 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 na.
Should have had a violin, kind of like iteration of our theme song, right?
Exactly. So, what big idea am I talking about, guys? What grand beauty are we discussing? And what grand beauty and big idea and motorcycles do me and Dennis have in common? It's ownership of bikes designed by the one and only Pierre Terblanche, South
hmm
African born designer, famous or infamous, depending on your point of view and depending on where you were on certain parts of the political spectrum in the summer and fall of 2002, as its design was unveiled to quite the controversy. Before I get to main thesis about Pierre Terblanche, the design and some of his most famous bikes and infamous bikes, there's this idea that in literature, in philosophy, in art, that the artist, the creator who exists on the outside of culture and looks in, is more able to see the future of where that culture is heading. And many times, you can find that it predicts 4, 5, 6 years in the future where the culture will go. Thomas Sheehan, UCLA professor of literature, once wrote a book called 1910, The Emancipation of Dissonance, from which I stole that line for a post,
hmm
but he stole that line from Arnold Schobert, famous atonal composer of turn of the
Hey, like you
century.
said, great artists steal, right?
Right, good artists create great artists. Steal, right? Picasso or something. I think I said that. 1910 is a foremost year where the Oedipus complex was released. The idea, Kandinsky dropped the idea of abstract art. Schoenberg wrote his thesis on atonal and the 12-tone scale and the what he referred to as emancipation of dissonance. It was also the year with the highest suicide rate on record. And it was a year where madness, hold on, the death drive, and a lot of other what and if you look at that year and the artists ago, is a very large school of thought that it was predicting the First World War, the madness that European countries would delved into, and the kind of ensuing insanity afterwards. So you could say the soul of the culture was darkened ahead of that war. While not nearly as dramatic, I am going to go not just talking about how cool the 999 was, the MH900E, the Super Mono, the Sport Classics, but that Pierre Terblanche is designed, if analyzed through the view of art history and philosophy, successfully predicted the economic collapse of 2008, successfully predicted Western culture's return to nostalgia and insulating and retracting as opposed to expanding. So yes, we'll talk about cool bikes. I'm also going to talk about a bunch of really boring stuff as well. That's interesting to me and hopefully to you guys. Rob is laughing hysterically, but you can't hear him, but I can hear him in my headphones. And Dennis is smiling, going, "What in the hell have I gotten myself into?"
No,
That being
no,
said,
no, no.
take a glass of a full-bodied red, take a sip. My one is referred to as Backhouse because that's how I roll, and we will get into talking about famed. Rob is still laughing. We will get into talking about famed, infamous designer Pierre Terblanche. So we could discuss a lot of the mundane details about Pierre, but realistically, this is a podcast. You're here to hear us talk about our opinions, our ideas. We could you know literally read his Wikipedia page or his biography, and that's pretty much what I'm going to do. South African born guy, studied in London, ended up taking a job in design after working in advertising for a certain number of years, joined Ducati in 1989, worked under, as Dennis owns also a bike by famed designer Tamburini. And when
Hmm.
he left to go work for, start his own company to relaunch Ambi-Gusta, Pierre took over designing, obviously probably one of the most impossible tasks you could do in motorcycle design, which is follow up the 916, 998, 996.
Yeah.
Before he did that, though, he designed the famous Super Mono, perhaps one of the most famous motorcycles in collecting motorcycle history. We're not going to get too much into that. That was mostly a very short design, interesting bike. They only made like 67 of them. They were racing bred specific. They did design the 900 SS later off of it. I had one. Her name was Charlene, oddly enough. She was a half Fair CR. It was still to this day the best bike I ever had. The girlfriend at the time that I dated cried when I sold it. So you could tell how important that bike was to her. But he first real design that kind of shook up things and shook up the world, and really what drew my attention to him and probably drew you if you are over the age of 30 was when Ducati dropped kind of the bombshell design at the Tokyo Motor Show, the MH900E. Rob, if you could put that up on the screen, you will see quite a radical looking bike. Dennis, I think you could agree if you were to look at it right now.
Yeah, and actually, that's not what I was thinking when you first. I don't know why I was thinking the monster, but this is not what I was thinking.
No. So the monster was designed before. Pierre Terblanche actually did design a couple of monster adaptations, the
Mm.
S4R, some minute changes, but the MH900E is a drastic looking bike. It's a throwback to Mike Halewood, obviously MH, obviously stands for Mike Halewood, his famous runs in Ducati. Some would consider the actual GOAT, screw Valentino Rossi, Marc Marquez, Keith and all that. Halewood is the real GOAT. I'm not necessarily inclined to disagree. You could make a pretty good argument for that. But the MH900E was an interesting bike, not just for its design and its kind of its neoclassical lines. You look at it; it had some design elements. It had the single-sided swing arm, all the 916, but it had that kind of classical throwback nostalgia. But what was really interesting about the MH900E that it was groundbreaking wasn't necessarily its design cues, although it's obviously a gorgeous, beautiful bike. Although if you ask Pierre, it sits a little too high and doesn't hold quite enough fuel. I don't think anyone that bought it cares about that, but he
Yep.
did nuance and nitpick that in an interview I watched the other day. What was really interesting about the MH900E is the way it was released. We're talking about 20 or almost 20 years ago. We're talking about in the winter of 1999, the bike was announced that it would be available for purchase direct to consumer via the interwebs, right? Back
That's
when like
crazy.
you still had dial-up and modems and the World Wide Web was so referred to it, and it was available on January 1st, 2000 at 0 hours and 1 minute GMT. They would make a limited number of them. They sold out the first 1,000 units in 30 minutes, something like that. You can find on the Wikipedia page. And then they sold out the remaining 1,000 within a month. They built 1,000 one year, 1,000 the next. So what you found with this design element wasn't only just the beginnings of what you would have in the motorcycle industry of the kind of returning to nostalgia. This was still a time when we were entering the 4-year phase of 600s, the constant, then the 2-year phase. So to take a bike and design a complete throwback bike with a couple of modern styling elements kind of hinted at what he would do later with that neoclassical design with the sport classics. But the MH900E is a pretty radical looking bike. It's definitely discordant. There's a lot going on for how little bodywork there actually is, for how
Yeah.
little stuff there actually, if you actually look at it, it's weirdly busy for how
Well, I'm looking
simple and
I'm
naked
looking
it
at
is.
it right now, and the remarkable thing is if I put my hand on the bottom half, it looks very retro, and if I put my hand on the top half, it looks very modern. It's almost like a
Right. So
hard line.
right, exactly. It's almost like a demarcation line between, the retro and the modern. It
Yeah.
still used the 2-valve air-cooled bike, the same engine that my fateful 900 SS had. Still used the tubular frame, which Rob is quiet, can't hear me. He's smiling though that he would hate. But look at that frame; you can't hate that frame. But what you saw was a couple of modern design elements. the rear exhaust, obviously famous with the 916 and the single-sided swing arm, the 3-spoke. I think it had a 4-spoke wheel. I can't see the spokes on it right now, but it had a very
5
similar
spoke,
design.
yeah.
Yeah, 5-spoke. Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't running the
Very racy.
spokes that we would come later to see, where you actually had that you would see in the Sport Classics. It still had the
Yeah.
mag wheels.
Mhm.
It had more, spokes on it, but for me, this bike was revolutionary. I remember when Dennis and I went to the Motorcycle Misfits podcast some years ago, and they asked us what our up the butt bike was. I think Dennis actually said it, MV Agusta, but I actually said the MH900E.
Yeah, yeah.
That this is one of the greatest designs, in my opinion, that you see in modern motorcycle history. Um, like you said, there's a clear. It's something that it's interesting that you brought up, Dennis, because what I referred to this bike at, like in our syllabus, is this was the bike that was beginning his move towards discordance in the design, and
Yeah.
also it hinted at that neoclassical design. But that hard line is totally true. There is basically an equator directly across the center line of that bike, left to right,
Yep.
right to left, that marks modern, overtly retro. And what's interesting about this versus the Sport Classics that we'll talk about later is that the retro is very, very, very retro. It's not
Mhm.
retro, but with angular designs. It's not a combination of the two. It's not what I would call neoclassical, a reimagining of classical. It is classical. It's very similar to the Triumph relaunch of the Bonnevilles. The new Bonnevilles are classical. There is no modernism to that bike in
Yep.
any way. It's not a reimagining, a reinventing. It is literally a redoing. And the
Yep.
MH900E is still that. But when you talk about how you would release this revolutionary retro bike via this world-changing platform that we were only beginning to scratch the surface on. We're talking about before Amazon, before any the idea that that cutting out a dealer, cutting out a middleman, direct to consumer. It was basically kickstarted in a sense. You put
That's
your
true,
deposit
actually.
down. I mean, you talk about Elon
That's true.
Musk and his 99 and his Model 3, and that he followed
Yeah.
this. It was so ahead of its time that it was almost comical, and not every part of it was ahead of its time. How it
Dude,
was released,
it was so ahead of its time, I never heard of it until now. Like, I thought
right?
that prior to this, the only time they did anything close to that was when they released the production version of the Desmosedici,
Mhm.
I think the GP06 or something. Yeah, I
Yes,
mean, but that wasn't really available to customers, it was available to existing Ducati owners, the limited number, but this is the
you had
first
to
time
have
I've heard of.
to get a
Yeah,
Desmond Zadishi. Not only you had to be a 99R customer to get
yeah,
that. Talk
exactly,
about
yeah,
fucking exclusive, right?
yeah,
So, but kind of in the thesis of what I said earlier about how his designs, when viewed, like when analyzed from outside, you were forward thinking to the level that they viewed the disruption that the internet was going to cause in our culture. This is a and Rob is laughing still at me. This is a clear as day example of it, how it was released and how it was designed. So for me, I look back at the 900D and I see a context that's far deeper than just like, hey, a red motorcycle that looks like Mike Halewood wrote it.
wow. No, so basically a very radical thought distributed in a radical way at the time.
Yes, and radical enough that Mike Halewood's wife, widow, would
Yeah.
go on to sue them
Yep.
for use of his name, his likeness, by using the MH in the title. Even though he rode for Ducati as a factory rider, that she would sue for use of his licensing and likeness. They ended up settling out for retroactive licensing. Obviously, connecting to him was important, but it's not. You can see why later, when they did the new Sport Classics, that Paul Smart became the new name associated with it, and not Mike Halewood, because the family was still kind of there was some
Yeah,
bad blood in how that all went down.
right.
So yeah, you've heard me wax poetic on the MH900 and all of that stuff, but like, and we mentioned the Super Mono, but the 900 SS, but like the reason we're all here, and the reason that we're talking about, the reason anyone even knows about Pierre Terblanche in any
Yep.
meaningful manner is, Dennis, is that bike behind you by chance? Could you actually put it on screen?
No. No. I
is
wish.
the uh, is the vaunted replacement successor to the 916, not the spiritual successor, from which
Nope.
Dennis does own the
Mhm.
F4 for MV Agusta, but the literal Ducati Superbike successor, the 999/749. It's kind of funny when I go back and I think about how this bike was received, and I could think of that a motorcycle could, like, how innocent was the world? that the move that like I remember like being in my early 20s or late teens, whatever it was, and I think people were aghast at this bike.
Yeah.
It changed it angered people in a way that you only think of like old men old conservative men looking at like an abstract art by like Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko and being viscerally angered that people think this is pretty, right? Because it is the first time it showed that you are out of touch. Like when
Right.
Arcade Fire won the Grammy for Best Album, that's when baby boomers knew they weren't cool because they didn't know who Arcade Fire was, right? So like when the 999 came out, there's this just like your line on the MH900, there is this demarcation line of people who are not only don't like it, but have literal visceral like anger towards this
Yeah.
bike
I mean,
versus
I think I
people.
think I think people were really hoping to continue on, but what happened was it was a very hard fork in the road, is what Ducati and Terblanche took with the 999.
Right, but what you found, what you took with them was a couple of things. Is every single part of this bike was designed, okay, and it wasn't just form. There was function. The kickstand is we all had Ducatis, man. Like your old Ducati kickstand was a piece of like rounds fucking tubing stock they found on the floor in Bologna, and they welded a quarter to the bottom of it. It's like a spring on it, right? And that was your kickstand. But look at the 999 swing arm. I don't know if Rob can zoom up on that swing. Excuse me. The kickstand. Every single part of this bike was designed, and it so accurately predicted the angular discordant style, the arrival of wings in the modern aspect. These air deflectors, now theirs were vertical; they weren't horizontal, literal wings. But it does remind me in the way that wings were received early on in MotoGP in your 2016 kind of season when they were getting real radical, and people were freaking the fuck out. And it
Whoa,
was like
whoa, wait. Are you telling me that the bike that I love predicted the coming of age of the MotoGP bikes that I hate because of the winglets?
Pierre
I'm
Terblanche
hav
is even quoted as saying that he believes that 999 successfully predicted the long, low layout where short wheelbase but long swing arm pivots far more forward than usual. And the if you look at the Desmos Sedici and where it went, it basically followed the 999, even though Desmos Sedici was pure function over form. There was no attention paid to anything other than get Caparossi to go win races.
Yeah, I guess I never thought about it, but now that you mention it, yeah, I can see it.
Right. I mean, what was interesting is they took away the single-sided swing arm, but what did they add? They added a very interesting, robust, asymmetrical swing arm. And I really think this was one of the first times that you started seeing heavy design elements of asymmetry in bikes. That now,
Yeah.
when you go back and you look at Aprilias, you look at the BMW, you look at a lot of other bikes, and you see this asymmetry as an accepted normal design cue. But in 2003, it was literally angering people. That
Mhm.
you look at the bike became busy with vertical slats all over it, busy with weird running lights on the windscreen, which they later removed. And I think in the later years, 2005, 2006, before it kind of was replaced with a 1098, it had some of the busyness removed, slowly
Yeah,
smoothed out,
yeah.
which I think was a mistake because, and we've talked about this, they went to they went retrograde to the 1098 and tried to recapture the magic of the 916, which you can't do. You can't catch lightning in a bottle. You certainly
Right.
can't catch it twice. What was interesting about how the 999 was received is a time when we just talked about how the internet was changing things. People were it came at a time of growing uncertainty. The Iraq war was happening. People were all over. And I'm not getting into politics of for or plus the war, but I'm talking about is it for Western culture. The 999 arrived at a time when Western culture's uncertainty was just beginning to embrace insulating, hiding, and returning and looking back to something new. No one wanted the 999. It was stillborn from the get-go. It was unwanted.
Yeah.
Everyone just brutal, right? But I'll tell you right now, if you look at a 999 and a 1098, the 999 has aged so much better because the 999 was looking forward 7 years
Yeah,
while the 1098 was looking back. So
right.
figuratively speaking, that 999 is only a couple of years old, but that 1098 is 25 years old.
I mean, you
You
think
know,
about it right now, what bike or what design looks like a 999 right now? Like, nothing since it came along, you know?
Right, it's distinctive, but it predicted certain cues. The angularness of bikes, you see it with what ended up happening with R1s years later. Aprilia certainly embraced angularness of it. Later Ducati models that were vaunted and celebrated, the Hypermotard, the Sport Classics, the original models of those that Pierre designed were grown and accepted and lauded, really. But the 999 came with such a negative response that it was amazing to me. I remember having friends that were angry. Like, you could go buy a 916, but the idea that Ducati would make an ugly bike, I don't think it was ugly. I always thought it was amazing. I mean, like I said, it reminds me of a guy who'd seen a Kandinsky painting for the first time, or a Mark Rothko painting for the first time, or an Ad Reinhardt painting, and wondered, what is this? And it was an example of, if I don't understand it, it is bad. Right, and that's something what is happening with culture in general that you see. I don't understand this, hence bad. I'm paraphrasing here. Picasso had a line that if you don't understand Cubism, that's not Cubism's fault. Okay, art is a language. If Dennis starts speaking French to me right now and I don't understand it, that's not a reflection on the language of French.
Oui, oui.
Any
Oui, oui.
oui, right? That is a reflection on my inability to understand that language. And I think what you found an entire generation of people finding themselves not understanding the direction the world was going. Thus, I hate it.
Yeah.
And I am going to make sure that you feel bad if you like it.
And I think that personally for me, because I did own a 749S for at least a year and a year and a half, and every time I would walk in the garage and look at it, I couldn't help but think of the tragedy that we would never know where that design could have gone because it was so hated and dismissed.
Right, exactly. What happened? They insulated to the 1098. They had success in racing, but the 999 had success as racing as
Oh
well,
yeah,
and
yeah.
forward and abroad. And that kind of brings me to another point, that the 999 entered Superbike at the exact moment that the Flamini Group went to, excuse me, that the four stroke entered MotoGP. That MotoGP took over. World Superbike retracted. It became the all Ducati series at one point. Then the Flamini Group switched to Pirellis. So not only was it a design that was ill received early on, but then the idea of Ducati being linked to racing success, which would have made the bike, be like, you could say, well, it wins races. That
Yeah,
asymmetrical swing arm is fast, and I might not like the way it looks, but it's fast and it's functional. Or
yeah,
those vertical slats and those air deflectors, I'm not so sure, but you know what? They sure do cut a line through. They sure do keep me stable when
yeah,
leaned over.
yeah,
But there was no point of reference for it to happen. Hogston would go on to win the title on it. James Toseland would go on to win the title on it, but he would be going against guys like Regis Laconi and Hogston against Ruben Jaus. It would never really receive. I remember when Pierre Francesco Chile won on that weird yellow 998 hybrid bike, and I'm really dating myself here. If you
What?
remember, yeah, look it up. I probably should
Wow.
have found that picture. I only
Yeah.
thought about it just now, and people celebrated that like it meant something more than a privateer won a bike. Like it was celebrated as the proof that the 999 sucks. Which again to me is the lasting image of an art design, is whether it elicits passion, right? If it elicits passion, you can
Some
be
kind of a
passionately
response, yeah.
happy or passionately mad.
Right.
I'm angry as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. You know what I mean? Like that's, if you elicit passionate response, the job of art has been done.
Mhm.
And no one really elicits passionate response to the 1098. They simply were like, it was a relief, but it was
Yeah,
a
it was a relief.
deflation. It was a
Mhm.
deflation. It didn't grow anything. So the 999, when I look at it, I look at design cues and I see not just the design elements that were radical, forward thinking, but I see when you look at how he designed it and what he designed, he was predicting where bikes would be in 15 years now. And he was predicting through that response. And if you were to watch what would happen, if you look at it through the lens now, and then you look at kind of the political climate and the artistic and cultural climate that we have right now with upheaval, not dealing with it well, not dealing with change, not embracing the new, but a return to the old in every aspect of our cultural life. And you were to analyze what would happen in 6, 7, 8 years through these works. I think it's clear as day to see, what was going on.
You're making me miss that bike, man. You're making me
Yeah,
miss.
I don't know why you sold. Luckily, you sold it to get another acceptable bike. You know what I
That's
mean?
true, but why not have both? Why not have
Right.
both?
Why not? And that is an excellent point. Why not have both? Look, Tamburini left and he moved on to relaunch MV Agusta. They designed the F4 Oro, which was the centerpiece of the Guggenheim Art of the Motorcycle exhibit. It was and is a timeless classic, and it was the true successor to the 916 design. It was not Turbolaunch's job to weirdly kind of succeed the 916. It was his job to move Ducati forward. That design element, just because it had an MV logo slapped on it, wasn't dead in the water. It just moved to a different plane. Just like Fight Club 2 was a graphic novel and not a movie and not a book.
I do have a question for you, just going back on Turblanche. Did you,
Yes.
in your comments, do you think he actually predicted, or did he himself push the design that way?
I think a little of both. The guy was no dummy. He educated in London, South African born, heavy. If you were to think about that, did he predict it? You're talking about someone who before design worked heavily in advertising. He knew and analyzed the needs and wants of consumers and what they were purchasing. This was not the Aprilia Moto 6.5 that this was not designed for design purpose like the MH900 was. We're just going to design it. And if you want it, you can be one of the 2,000 people that get it. It's going to be weird. We're going to build a frame in Holland, and we're going to build
Right.
the right. We're going to sell it to Japan. That
Yeah, it
was
wasn't a
designed for design.
novelty.
It was not a novelty, and it wasn't art for art's sake. It was
Yeah.
art. It was objects de art. If you go to the Louvre and you go to that section, it was designed with purpose. So I do think that he successfully predicted. I think that he pushed the envelope on purpose. If
Mm.
you like we said before, no publicity is bad publicity. If you design a bike that elicits that level of response, guess what? Your bike's on the cover of every magazine. Your bike is potentially on the cover of magazines that weren't normally covering motorcycles or motorsport. I think that the design was purposeful I think it was cognizant of more than that, because someone who's keenly aware of advertising. Now you got to remember, the average designer that designs a bike, even when he's talking about design and functionality, it's not his job to figure out how to sell the bike. It's his
Mhm.
job to design the bike, and then sales, advertising, PR, input, add their ideas to it. You have a final product that they know they can then sell. But in this case, you
Right.
had a designer who knew how to sell, who knew what to sell. It reminds me of that famous Howard Stern quote: the average Howard Stern listener listens for 45 minutes, and the average Howard Stern hater listens for an hour and a half because they want to see what he says next. And I think that the 999 was very much in line with that. Let's make a radical departure from the design that we have. It will be so radical and the design so polarizing that we will get coverage on both sides of the aisle.
Mhm.
Okay. So, the 999 is obviously the bulk of it, but when I talk about how he predicted the economic collapse and how the designs helped kind of predict the insular nation of or the insular idea of where we were going, there's a couple other bikes he designed that were famously well received. The Hyper Motard and the Sport Classics. The Sport Classics were designed in the same year, and they were a heavy example of this neoclassicalism that I'm talking about. And the Hyper Motard was a radical angular departure with a "who's this bike made for" kind of thing. It's
Right.
not really it's called a motard, but it's not really a motard. You weren't jumping the thing, and it's called a hyper, but it had an air cooled engine and a gas tank that was like a 1.8 gallons, right? Like you get bigger gas tanks on dirt bikes. But when I talk about the collapse, what you're talking about is the Hyper Motard was released at Tokyo Motor Show, the Milan show, to outrageous fanfare, universally praised. loved. Holy crap! It's the retribution of Pierre. It is on all aspects of motorcycle culture loved this bike. And guess what was required to make this thing happen? First of all, Ducati didn't want him to design it, and he famously used shitload of existing parts from other bikes to make it get done. So it doesn't have a specific frame. It's got a borrowed frame. It's got a borrowed engine. Weird things like its mirrors and stuff were borrowed. Like everything, not everything, but anything that could have been borrowed from a different model was slapped onto this thing to make it the most minimally expensive bike to make. Like, cost cutting everywhere, despite the fact that we're talking about design elements of a popular bike in the greatest economic boom and like economy driven by impulsiveness, debt, and excess that you would ever find. And here, this guy is designing a bike that's purposefully reductionist. It doesn't have almost any new parts.
Mm.
The new parts it does have are minimalist as all hell. And then what do? They send out an online survey. How much do you like the bike? How much would you spend on the bike? What kind of engine should it have? What, like, they basically begged you to let us know that you would buy this before we did. So we're talking about how when they released we're talking about the time period where they released the F3, then the F4, then the F4i, the R6s and the GSXRs are nearing like a 2.5 year relaunch span. There was so much excess. I mean, we're talking about like 20-inch rims on everything you could find. If you were around in 2004 and 5, the fucking world was crazy. It was crazy drunk on excess. And here is a guy saying, let's design minimalist bikes for minimalist cost, and let's go out of our way to know that people will buy these before we put them on the market. We basically have to have a proof of concept, a deposit drop down before we will even commit to making it. And the idea that he would do that with the Sport Classic and with the Hyper Motard in a time and period where people were buying anything and everything. I mean, you go to the lake now. We are talking to our friend Berto about this the other day at the Moto America race. If you went to a lake in 2005, what did you see? You saw huge boats with massive towers, buff jack frat boys wakeboarding, blasting whatever, I can't, blasting the shit while, rough riders and all that stuff on their wakeboard towers with their speakers. None of those people are here anymore, right? None of those people boat. It was excess for the sake of excess. Look what I own and look how much of it I own was literally the zeitgeist of the time. And what did Terblanche and Ducati do? They designed purposefully reductionist, purposefully deconstructed bikes, that were not exclusive, but spoken of as which, hey, we're not even sure if we want to sell these
That's
because they weren't.
that's pretty interesting because I thought you mentioned that this was released the same time as the Sport Classic.
So the Sport Classic was designed, and the models, the concept bikes, back when
Yeah.
concept bike, right? We're talking about, remember the Honda NR 1000? Like, remember that bike with the radial front brake cylinder? Again, I'm dating myself like a motherfucker here,
You
but
are actually.
big time, right? So you talk, yeah. Rob remembers. You can't hear him, but he remembers. He doesn't have a shirt on right now either. But we're talking about a time period where concept bikes were made, and Pierre designed these sport classics. They were far more radical in terms of their classical design than what you saw with the MH900 or the Bonnevilles that came popular.
Yeah.
But they weren't actually released till sometime later, 2005. And they released the 1 year Paul Smart limited edition, the gray and silver version that Rob is probably displaying right now, as well as the GT 1000 and the Sport 1000. I don't think I sent Rob a Sport 1000 image. But these bikes were, when I refer to neoclassicalism, this is really what I'm referring to, especially if you were to contrast that Paul Smart with the MH900. This Paul Smart is far more angular. There isn't that clearly demarked line between old and new. The bikes had Öhlins forks, Öhlins shocks. They were more streamlined. They certainly look more modern. They're a reinterpretation of the retro, as opposed to the Bonneville, the MH900, or some other bikes, which were a reflection of the retro. It is. You go look in a Triumph shop right now and you look at a T100, it looks like a 71 Bonneville. like by
I think
design. They
I
built
think the overall shape and silhouette of the bike, especially from a distance, looks, definitely like retro. You have to look closely at its parts to realize that this is not an old bike. This is actually a pretty modern bike. Like, you look at that swing arm where it's also a tubular frame, but from a distance, the overall shape of the bike looks very, very, classic and old
Right,
school.
and then you get up close, and what do you see? You see the angles. You see where the fairing meets the tank is far
Yeah.
more angular and sharp than on the
Mhm.
on the than on the Mike Halewood design bike. Again, like
Yeah.
you said, you see that tubular swing arm. Functional but interesting. When was the last time you saw that kind of level I mean, Rob is aghast right now that tubular frame is now multiplying into tubular
I
swing arm.
I think the only other maker or bike that I can think of that has a tubular swing arm is probably one of the Benellis.
Yeah, exactly. But what's interesting is that right at a time when that excess was exploding, you saw Pierre designing bikes that were purposefully rearward looking. Um,
Mhm.
at a time, you look at culture now, and what does everyone complain about? Everything's a remake, everything is a re-envision, everything is a reboot. And you look at no one buy, why does everyone ride an R6? Because none of the fucking big Japanese manufacturers have made a better super sport in like a decade. I
Right,
think Rob
right.
actually sold his newer bike to get an older R6, right? That was just in better. Like that's how much the motorcycle industry has changed, and you see that the Triumph releases their Bobber Bonneville, which is even more rearward looking and nostalgic. And I think you see that. And so we talk about Pierre. He saw the visceral response and reaction to the 999 that was had, and he realized, oh, this is where the world is going. The world is
Right.
going that people are. We live in like there's a term, I'm may you live in interesting times. I don't know who fucking said it. It's probably sounds super cliche for me to say it, but when you live in uncertain times, things are far more interesting. But what people
Mhm.
tend to do in those uncertain times is look rearward to a time when they think things were better or made more sense. Now the times only made more sense because that's when you grew up to learn to make sense of things. But the internet has been the greatest upheaval in human history since Gutenberg printed the Bible, and since I mean, like, yeah, whatever. You can laugh all you want, but I'm being for real. Like, Rob is a super nerd like me. He has an aerospace engineer. So when I talk about the Prime Directive, you can't hear Rob, but he's laughing right now about Star Trek's Prime Directive. And the reason the Prime Directive existed was you could not give that level of technology in the Star Trek universe to a culture that wasn't ready for it because the insane upheaval that it caused reactionary violence. That was literally the Prime Directive. It was Captain Picard's number one rule he would not break. He broke it like 12 times. Yeah, right. But right, exactly. It's the same effect as what they call the Worf effect, where Worf was super strong and super powerful, so someone would beat him, but because they always beat him every season, he no longer was considered super powerful, because his superpower was a plot device. But the internet has done the same thing in many ways. The hyper connectivity and the quickness of which it happened, and the exposure to new ways of thinking, new ways of looking at the world, and new opinions causes people to react. And the way that they react, like any reaction, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and it's pushback. If I push on the ground right now, the ground pushes back to me. And anytime people react to something, they tend to react backwards. And that's exactly what happened with the 999. And Pierre, being the advertised genius that he was, absolutely capitalized on that and later would release these sport classics, which drew into the safe, comfortable, happy place that at the time 35, 40, 45-year-old guys, those who could afford an air-cooled bike with full Olin suspension, or why you would even want that, um, what we're hearkening back to, especially in kind of the uncertainty of those U.S. presidential elections, the war in Iraq, the exposure to the conflict in the Middle East between Western culture and that, and the sport classics, I think, are a perfect example of predicting where things were going to go. If you look at the sport classics released in 2005 and you look at 10, 12, 13 years on, it hasn't changed. It's only gotten stronger, that reactionary spirit in many aspects of it. And those same people that used to love that bike are now kind of like, or used to really hated the 999, are only older and more reactionary.
Well, this is less of a Pierre Terblanche question and more of a going back to a Ducati question. But in my opinion, like we already said that the 1098 is more of like a design back to the 916. In my
Right.
opinion, the Panigale is also just another evolution of the 1098. So my question to you, Kev, is do you think Ducati can still find themselves, and will they actually dare turn another hard fork on the road like they did with Terblanche's design? Like, do you think maybe they've learned their lesson with Pierre and they won't do it again, or do you think they'll find themselves in a position to push the design again, either with Pierre or somebody else?
What's interesting to me about pushing the design when it comes to Ducati is on their MotoGP bike, they did it. They
Hmm.
did it to a level that no one would have expected, and in doing so, revolutionized the sport.
Yeah, I mean, you're
Wings
right. Like when they
galore.
first came out with the winglets, I hated that with the fucking passion. But that's
Right.
exactly what you were talking about, right?
Right. And right here's your so they have these winglets, they design them and they're slowly growing, and everyone's kind of like, what the fuck is going on? And then all of a sudden, 2016, the Andreas come out and they have like swords and axes hanging off the fucking bike, right? Like they're going into battle, but they're functional and what do you see? But that same age group of people who grew up with the smooth, clean lines reacting irrationally to what is a functional, interesting design element that sets the bikes apart, especially
Yeah,
MotoGP bikes. Can't do
guilty.
they have the balls to do it on a production street bike? I'm not
Right.
so sure. And it's funny that you bring that up because the Dorna and MotoGP just announced new limits, technical regulations for 2019, and includes further restrictions on the wings, which of course is pretty much designed to punish Ducati specifically, because Ducati figured out if you just connect the wings, you can actually have twice as many surface area and you're within the rules. So I think that when you look at that design element of pushing forward and did they learn their lesson from Pierre, I think honestly, anytime you bite the hand that feeds you, you have worrisome, you have a little bit of a tail between your legs situation. But
Yeah.
MotoGP allows freedom of design on an unparalleled level in the motorcycle industry, short of concept only creations. But they don't really have a marquee designer right now that could be the namesake for those kind of custom one off, maybe even just show bikes that are really advertising purpose only. And it's too bad they do that because what Pierre also showed was is that you could have a namesake artist make concept bikes, and if there's demand, make them
Yeah.
and sell them. That's you're talking about what they proved early on in 2000, and with the Sport Classics selling out and the Paul Smart limited edition being only 1 year, is that a marquee designer and with heavy emphasis on concept bikes, the Hybrid Motard, another example, you can sell a large number of units or a smaller number of large margin units, like I talked about with the Hybrid Motard being created primarily of parts from other bikes. You sell a small number of large margin units is just as good as selling a shitload of R6s at low margins. And you have repeat customers, customizing customers, guys who spend a lot of money. You look at most 900H or MH900Es out there, and you're going to see highly customized bikes. I've seen some in person, and there's a huge aftermarket. How could there be such a large aftermarket, little aftermarket market for a bike that there was only 2,000 of them? Because everyone wants to customize them further and make them more radical. I wish they would, Dennis. Honestly, the problem is, and you spoke with the Panigale, and look what happened after the 999 was released. The 999 still won a Superbike championship with
Hmm.
Troy Bayliss
Yeah.
against Four Strokes, against the return of the Japanese leader bikes. The rules changed. The 1098 appeared, but their results since leaving that design element and really trying to make sure we also satisfy the needs of certain buying customers has significantly dropped every single year. The Panigale was designed maybe too much red wine. I'm drawing a blank on our homeboy who designed the monocoque frame. Um, God, what's his name? Rob, in my ear, if you could tell me, pop it up. The MotoGP designer who designed the monocoque before they moved on.
Oh, you mean Filippo? Felipe
Yes,
Preziosi?
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Could sorry.
You're fired,
That was
Rob.
a You're fired, Rob. You're not even doing anything. That was an example of a bike that was keen design, but they weren't allowed to go all the way with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
When your elements are restricted because you're worried about reaction. This is the same reason why, and I'm not trying to say like failed artist or whatever. I was relatively successful. I had a number of solo shows early on in my late 20s, and things were fine. I sold, but there's a point where when you create something that is designed, whose sole purpose is to please purchasing customers, there is a bit of there's a bit of holding back
Mm.
because you're worried. You can't experiment. It's hard to move forward. You move forward in inches instead of feet.
And I
You
want to say,
can't.
because you brought up Preziosi was probably the last kind of radical Ducati guy. Well, now they have Gigi leading the race team and maybe even bike development. And where did he come from? Aprilia, whose success is somewhat not mimicking but taking upon what's established with the Japanese bikes. Twin spar aluminum frame, kind of a conventional aluminum swing arm. Nothing really radical about it.
Right. And you worry as nothing really radical about it is probably the worst thing you could do to describe an Italian
Mm,
motorsport marquee.
yeah.
If you were to tell Lamborghini that there's like it's pretty cool, but there's nothing really radical about it,
Yeah.
they'd fucking kill themselves. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? If you were to tell it to Honda, that would be a confirmation of their mission statement. You
Yes.
know what I mean?
Yes.
Like you
Yes.
look at Honda released the in 2004 they released the CBR 1000RR. It lacked a slipper
Uh-huh.
clutch. It didn't have. It was slightly, and they said, look, we still want to make a street bike, so it needs to be calmed down. So nothing particularly radical about it other than the unit pro link suspension, which they stole from Ducati, by the way, and one of the more blatant examples of corporate espionage.
Well, no, I think Honda did have that electronic steering damper
No,
for what
no,
it's worth.
not the. Yeah, yeah, exact. They did have the electronic steering wheel, but that unit pro link suspension was fully stolen from the early Ducati GP models.
Yeah.
Um, and then because they're Honda, where they like they said they would just buy Ducati if there's a problem. Um, so yeah, I do think that you worry that design elements. I think the 999 left a scar on the motorcycle community, which is dare, but don't dare too greatly. Or
Hmm.
I'm reminded of that quote from the Keanu Reeves Al Pacino movie about the devil. The fuck was
Devil's
that movie
advocate.
called? Devil's Advocate, about look but don't touch, touch but don't taste, taste but don't enjoy. Like never go beyond the one step.
Mm.
Don't like you warned about the 999. Was it too radical? Well, it did, it had three headlights up the front, some wings, and a double-sided swing arm. Like what if they just left? Like that was like the big thing when they went back to the 1098, which was, oh my god, it has a single-sided swing arm again. So sweet. Now I look at the single-sided swing arm like I did look at underseat exhaust, like this quaint little thing that's like, haha, remember when people thought that was funny? It looks like the wheel's not connected. Like that's like
Like the bike's
I look
floating.
at those like I look at spinners sometimes, like
Mm.
I mean I have friends, again, Dennis has I love the F4 but that is a whole different story. The F4, you want to see design elements, Dennis, go look at your F4 and look at the spokes on the mag wheels and look at the brake rotor carriers and notice they are the exact same star design lined up in the exact same pattern, so your lines of symmetry are never broken.
Hmm. That's true.
Yeah. Yeah, fuck yeah, it's true. 50, yeah, exactly. So to kind of go back to my thesis when I talk about, like, we're talking about Pierre Terblanche and his designs. You may or may not like them, but whether you like them or you don't like them, you feel strongly about it. No one feels strongly at the Panigale. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
Fuck, it's cool.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? No one viscerally hates it, but no one looks at the Panigale and thinks, holy shit, that thing is crazy. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
um, whereas what Turbolaunch was able to do was design a bike that elicits a response so great that 15 years later we're talking about it.
Right.
We're talking about it with like a lot of enthusiasm and passion and memory and I don't want to say nostalgia because I put a negative spin on the idea of nostalgia, but I'm just kind of talking about that time period. And I think that when you look back at these designs in context, you see a guy who was successfully predicting the direction of Western culture almost to a T. Not just in his designs, but in his release of the designs, the functionality of the designs, the sourcing of his designs from farm to table, so to speak, to use a super hippie Northern California term, because that's where I am and that's who I am. But from farm to table, this guy was using artistic and functional designs to show us where we were going before we got there.
I gotta go buy another one. Fuck.
This guy's gonna come on the show. I'm gonna fucking send this to him.
You should actually.
Right. So, in the spirit of like of visceral designs, in the spirit of talking about these classic ideas, Dennis, if I were to ask you right now between the designs we're talking about, the 999, the Sport Classics, the MH100, which one for you is the one that you think is the most beautiful and interesting? Which is the one that really connects to you, not just on a functional level, but like I put this thing in my garage, I could just look at it.
Yeah, I mean, and because not just because I've already done it, but I just distinctly remember when I first saw the 999, or maybe it was 749. It just made me drop everything. I'm like, what the heck was that I was just looking at? Like it elicited such a response to me. And maybe because I'm also, when I was younger, I was also an artist. So it not only called to the motorcyclist in me, but also the artist in me. I saw something that was literally like art in motion.
And let me ask you something about this art, Kay, because there's something I want to get to regarding that design of that. I knew you'd say that because you bought the fucking bike.
Yeah.
But when you first saw the 999, and you may not remember, but try to recall, when you first saw the design cue, did you see it in person or did you see it in print?
I want to say I saw it in person first.
And this is key because I will admit, not unlike me, the 999 photos very poorly, but in person is amazingly handsome. um, right, Rob's laughing too. The 999 proportions are required to like release the beauty. When you see the bike in photo, especially the like Ducati was poor in the stock photos they released. Rob, if you can put up that one that shows the front from like a downward angle that I sent you, the linear vertical portrait style photo. A lot of the initial stock pictures that were released to magazines and corporate media were significantly unflattering, almost if purposeful, which goes back to my question, Dennis, of did he do it on purpose? Yes, because no one that was trying to specific, like it's like you don't take selfies like this, right? Like I'm not like, hey, what's going on? Like that's not how you do it. Like you hold it up, like you do the selfie thing, right? Like the MySpace angle. That's what I'm saying, right? Yeah, damn, Rob, you just dated yourself hard. You can't hear Rob, but he mentioned that was the MySpace angle. But so they released a series of pictures, and almost all of them are like purposefully unflattering. They're either dead set straight across from the side, exact landscape, no perspective whatsoever, or they were like on the front from below, weirdly looking up, which of course it had these air deflectors that were rounded and they scooped up and down. It exaggerated and made the bike look out of balance, which it was not. This is a perfectly balanced bike, in my opinion, back to the design elements, even down to the kickstand. But they released a series of photos, their media releases, right? Like the same thing we do with most of our releases on our Instagram are the stock media releases the teams put out, the press releases. And to me, if you see the bike in person, I defy anyone to go look at a 749R in person with the carbon fiber fairing where the leading edge was left unpainted and clear coated so you could see that perfect made carbon, and the 749 was simply a cutout of paint so you can see the carbon. The attention to detail is paramount, but the pictures were incredibly poor in trying to bring forth the look of this bike. I found that with this bike was received extremely poorly, especially in like the cycle world audience, which is a certain demographic. The cover was an ugly example. All of the photos were ugly, and the demographic it was. I go back to this on purpose because you brought Dennis. I believe they purposely made this bike controversial down to the point of the photos they choose to release of it. Because if you take a 999 from the MySpace angle or from the Instagram angle, you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
that would have had more than top 8 friends. Yeah, top 8 friends. Remember those?
I think that this is the best compliment I can give to that bike and Pierre is that, like you guys know, I've owned a 749. I now have an F4, and I kid you not, every single woman in my life, rider and non-rider alike, when they've seen both, they keep telling me they prefer the 749 over the F4, and it
Right.
boggles my mind. But each and every
I
one of them prefers the
I
749.
had a 999, excuse me, a 99 900 SS. I had the half variant, so not the full Super Mono homage, but the
Yeah.
Super Mono inspired CR. I think one of the best bikes Ducati ever released. Um, I can specifically remember driving down Santa Rosa Avenue with my buddy Nick on that bike and having my Ben Bostrom replica Suomi with the American flag, the shininess, probably tats out, whatever, but that bike and literally two chicks leaning out their window and handing me their phone numbers written on paper, like because the bike was so dope. Like,
And it's
like
not it's not because you just look great in person as opposed to
No,
picture,
it
right?
was literally the bike. It was the bike elicited a response of like if you look Rob, pull the Super Mono images up with the yellow frame, number frame. That bike is pure sex. That bike is a woman on wheels. Okay, and I'm not objectifying thing here. What I'm saying is, if you look at that bike is sensuality. There's nary a straight line on that bike. Everything is a subtle curve that flows into another subtle curve that flows into another subtle curve. Every single part of the Super Mono and the Super Sport series of that year, 99 through 2003, I think they finished it, was like sensuality personified. I didn't really have talking about that bike on my syllabus because it didn't really fit kind of the thesis I was talking about,
Yeah.
because that was his early work before he kind of solidified what he wanted to do. But it really fits to what you're saying, is that what Pierre was able to do was bring a personalization to his designs that I don't like other people don't like. Like the new R6, or when the R6 dropped, the 2007 one, right? It had it had the air deflectors too, and it was so angular and it was dope, and everyone wanted to ride one, and every racer at AFM dropped like 1.5 seconds the moment they got on a stock one because the frame was so good, and then the gas tank hit the ground and exploded because it had a hard edge, you know. Um, Right, Rob's laughing because he has one. But none of those bikes elicited the response of. None of them like spoke to who people were as a person. It was still just a machine. And to me,
Mhm.
Pierre's bikes and your response to them tells me who you are as a person.
Mm.
That's the highest compliment I can give to the guy as an artist and a designer. And if he ever hears this podcast in some way, shape, or form, I hope he thinks that my waxing poetic is entertaining enough.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, rounding it up, kind of figuring out where we're going with this. For me, I think that there's a lot of stuff, but I brought it back to kind of using that idea of the year 1910. I brought up Arnold Schoenberg, who's a famous composer who who's famous for his atonality, although he didn't like that term, by releasing new tones that were initially designed to only create tension but not be tone elements or musical elements in and of themselves, is now probably viewed retroactively as one of the most influential composers in the modern world, certainly in postmodern, avant-garde, and modernity when it comes to music, because he released, to a lot of detriment of his own career, the freedom for people then to take those tones that were initially used as tension really only, or discordant or bothersome by design, and create beauty out of them. Later on, he was kind of labeled degenerate music, and I thought there was a quote here that that the Nazi Party of Schoenberg eventually called him decadent intellectual efforts. And I think if you go back to 2003, that is verbatim what people were saying about this design, that it was pretentious, that it was high art on purpose, and that it was decadent intellectually for the sake of being so. Yet what he did was release all of those discordant tones, tension, or the angles that I would say, and make them free for every designer then on to do. I guarantee you in
Mm.
20 years, every major motorcycle designer you talk to is listing Pierre Terblanche on the podium in the top 3 of important design elements in their work in their life.
Yeah. I mean, he's on mine, so
He's on mine. I don't fucking design motorcycles. You know what I mean? But I just talked about him for a fucking hour nonstop, like
Right.
with no breaks. I could do it for 2 more if Rob wasn't telling me to wrap it up.
In wrapping, I still have the phone number of the guy that I sold it to, and every year I text him asking if he still has it because I may buy it back from him, and I'm gonna keep
Nice.
doing that.
Buy it back. That'd be so sick.
Yes.
Right. So, right, you're gonna do it. So, anyways, guys,
Probably.
you know, thanks for listening to this one. Kind of a strange episode for sure, but we just released Rob and Dennis's analysis, the hardcore nerd out from an aerospace engineer's point of view. Now we're hardcore nerding out from a philosophy of art point of view. Tomorrow, or
This is
depends on
posh nerding out, man. Posh
posh
nerding.
nerding out, right? This is definitely that. We'll be having a Moto America episode with a special guest. Dennis, I think, is a great bridge of the gap between the Dionysus of me and I'm too drunk to remember the other side of Rob. So, but you get the point. So Rob's world makes it possible for people like me to wax poetic and add beauty, so that Rob has entertained while he makes sure the world actually exists and civilization doesn't crumble to a fall.
And I'm just in between, along for the ride for either one.
Right. So I'm Kevin. That's Dennis. Rob
Empty glass.
is below me in my screen, but not yours. But he trusts me, he's there. And this has been the BrotoGP Late Night Hour. I could have done this whole thing in my PBS voice, but I decided not to.